Thank you for attending President Biden's Pardon Legacy and the Future of the Federal Clemency Power. The event is hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. The chat is disabled, but you may submit questions at any time. Please note, however, that there is limited time available for Q&A during the webinar. Second, automatic closed captioning has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Show Caption in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel as soon as possible following the event. A link will be shared with all registrants via email as soon as it is available. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks to Yana and everybody else at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center here at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Incredibly pleased to be the moderator. I'm Doug Berman. I'm the Executive Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center and also the Newton D. Baker and Hostetler Chair in Law here at Moritz College of Law at the Ohio State University. And I've got a long list of things I'm already excited to ask our participants. We've got 4 spectacular experts to talk about President Biden's pardon legacy and the future of the federal clemency power, as the title says. Let me introduce those 4, and then I will talk about my plan for the next 70 minutes or so, and then we'll get to their opening discussion and then some Q&A. As Holly mentioned, there is the Q&A feature. I will try to keep track of that if you put some questions there, and depending on how the conversation goes, hopefully we can get to some of those as well. So for our 4 panelists, we're extraordinarily lucky to have, going in alphabetical order, which is also how they'll make their opening presentations, Rachel Barkow, who's the Charles Seligson Professor of Law and also the Faculty Director of the Zimroth Center on the Administration of Criminal Law at New York University School of Law. Then we have Larry Kuppers, former Deputy Pardon Attorney from the Obama administration, also former Acting Pardon Attorney during the Trump administration, and a former federal defender. Then we'll hear from Eric Luna, the Amelia D. Lewis Professor of Constitutional and Criminal Law, Foundation Professor, Faculty Director of the Academy for Justice at Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. And last but certainly not least, we've got Mark Osler, the Robert and Marion Short Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. And without much further ado, I've told all the panelists that I'd give them 5 or 6 minutes or so for some opening remarks, then invite some quick back and forth for discussion among the panelists based on their opening remarks, then turn to questioning. I've got some, I'll call them Biden-centric questions and Trump-centric questions, and then broader things we could talk about, but also encourage using the Q&A for those of you who I thank for joining us to make sure we try to cover all the topics. There are so many to cover. So I'll shut up and say, Rachel, you're on. Go for it.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Doug, and thanks to everybody for being with us today. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes with an overview of the Biden clemency record, in case the only thing you know about his clemency record is that he gave a pardon to his son. I would like to remind you that he has done other clemency grants as well, although not that many, actually. And from my personal view, that's one of the reasons why I find the Hunter Biden pardon so disturbing, is because he has been so stingy with respect to clemency relief for everyone else during his time in office. He's received more than 12,000 petitions, plus there were some waiting in line when he got there. And he's granted very few of them, 135, but that actually overstates what he's done. So, the 135 grants that he has, if he stopped today, that grant rate, given the number that he's received, would put him at the lowest grant rate of modern presidents. But it's even worse because when you peel back and look at who those 135 are, some of those are prisoner exchange diplomatic swaps. So you take those off the list, and you're down to 122 people who got clemency grants. Then you look further at who those people are, and you find out that 91 of them were people who were already out of prison. They were released under the CARES Act, which was the legislation passed during the pandemic that allowed for emergency temporary release for people who were vulnerable to COVID while incarcerated. And Attorney General Bill Barr, released thousands of people under that temporary release authority. So those people are already out. And they're on home confinement. And some of them also requested clemency so that there's no threat that they get sent back to prison. In my view, that should be the easiest categorical grant for every single one of them there is. But even there, President Biden has only granted, a tiny proportion of them. But it's a big proportion of his overall grants. So when you peel it all back, you find that he has only released in almost 4 years, 31 people from prison in his time in office. And that's while the federal prison population has skyrocketed. Instead of it continuing its trend of declining, which is what he inherited, it went up during his time in office. So, for me, if I had to grade him today, this is an F. There's still time. This is when you have the meeting with your student and say there's still time to pull it out. You have time in the semester remaining. But if you continue on this trajectory, unfortunately, things look really bad. That would be the meeting I would be having with him at this point, because this record is really shameful. There are petitions waiting for him. In some administrations past, we had heard that, the holdup was the Department of Justice. There really weren't any petitions to be granted. That's not the case this time around. We have an outstanding pardon attorney who has worked her tail off. There are petitions waiting for him. We know that. We've heard that from several sources. And they're just waiting at the White House. And while I was understanding of the fact that they didn't grant them before the election, so as not to create a distraction from what was happening, there's really no excuse for them to still be waiting. Like, at this point, it's just a question of you signed yes to all of them as president and you grant every single one of those. And to me, those should be the top priority. They have been vetted through the process. The pardon attorney, the Department of Justice, the DAG, everybody has said yes. Unlike the Hunter process, which was the personal fast track, these are people who went through the process. They did what they were supposed to. And to me, there's just no excuse for not granting those. So I'll stop there with my opening remarks, but I'm happy to take questions.
I appreciate that, Rachel, and the grading speaks no doubt to any academics that are on the Zoom today, and we appreciate that extraordinarily important perspective. Larry, you've been parts of the process at various points, and so you're now up to kind of give your overview, initial thoughts.
All right, thank you, Doug, and hello to everyone. First of all, I have to say I agree with everything Rachel said. I couldn't agree more. I think President Biden's clemency record is miserable. But I wanted to go over quickly some basics of federal clemency so that we're all on the same page when we're using certain terms. Let me start off by saying that the pardon attorney's office most commonly assesses and makes recommendations on 2 types of clemency grants. The first one is called a pardon after conviction, and it goes to anybody who has been convicted, served their sentence, has been in the community for at least 5 years, lived responsibly, lived productively, and applies for a pardon. That's a pardon after conviction. A pardon after conviction does nothing to expunge or negate the conviction itself. That still stands. Now, to me, the most important grant of clemency is called a commutation. And a commutation is a grant that reduces a person's sentence and may at times lead to the release of the person immediately. There were over 1,700 commutations granted by President Obama in what was an aberration for clemency history during his clemency initiative. The commutation does not expunge or negate the conviction, but it does a lot for the grantee by allowing that person to get out of prison sooner. Finally, and this has been in the news, there's something called a preemptive pardon. And a preemptive pardon is a pardon that is granted before a person is actually convicted of a crime. So the examples historically are one, President Gerald Ford's a pardon of President Nixon that was granted before he was even charged with crimes, even though there was plenty of evidence to charge him. Number 2, President Trump pardoned Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona before he was sentenced. One thing to understand about a preemptive pardon is that under federal law, you are actually not convicted until you're sentenced. So if you're actually found guilty of a crime, but not sentenced for that crime, and you get a pardon, at that point, you have no conviction. And guess what? That's exactly the sort of pardon that President Biden granted his son Hunter. That's a preemptive pardon. Okay, quickly, I just want to suggest that the pardon process really needs a lot of improvement. I would say a couple things now, just briefly. One, with regard to pardons after conviction, it should be done by a federal statute. Pardons after conviction are not risky. They're given to people who have lived in the community for 5 years without any problems, and they're just restoring rights. They're not expunging a conviction. The only tricky part about a pardon after conviction is whether it restores the right to bear arms. That might require an individualized inquiry to make sure the person would not be a danger. But otherwise, these pardons should be granted as a matter of statute, and they should be granted to thousands of people who are eligible. The harder part of clemency is commutations. Commutations bring up what is the Willie Horton situation, where you release somebody early from prison and that person commits a horrible crime. That's what happened with Willie Horton, and that's what killed Michael Dukakis's presidential aspirations. So with commutations, you really need to have a very careful process to evaluate the person and to make sure that the person will not present a danger to the community and has really earned release or reduction of sentence by being rehabilitated, by all the achievements while in custody. My concern with commutations, there should be, as Rachel said, a lot more of them. And especially there should be commutations of people who have in the past committed a violent crime or committed violent acts, but have rehabilitated. And because of the clan of prosecutors in DOJ that runs the clemency process in terms of recommendations to the president, the minute somebody has any sort of violence in their record, they are excluded from consideration for a commutation. And that's just wrong. Again, what they should be looking for is the person a danger, and has the person been rehabilitated and really earned release from prison? So those are my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry, and really appreciate you going over that terrain and sort of articulating that vision so effectively. Eric, that means you're up, and take it away.
Thank you, Doug. As always, a real pleasure to be here and to work with you and Yana. And it's always worth the price of admission to hear Doug say "the" in the Ohio State University as though he was dotting the I. And so it's terrific to be discussing this particular topic at this time, despite the obvious prompt of what seems to be some nepotism in the application of the clemency power. I want to begin by just mentioning an individual who I may not be here. I don't think he's on with us, but is I've been worked with, and who all of the work I've done with in this particular area is either on behalf of or in conjunction with, and that's Weldon Angelos. And you'll see why he has become so important to so many of the areas that we're discussing here. I'd more than give anything more than this is just to suggest a more of a 4 years on horseback, more like not Doug Berman style, but the Berman from ESPN, who does 3 minutes of football recap. Over the course of the past 4 years, beginning with Weldon being contacted with the White House counsel's office about continuing some of the work that had begun, as Rachel mentioned, under the Obama administration. And then subsequently trying to kind of raise some public awareness. We ended up doing something that you would never do in law, even under the guise of an amicus brief, which is get together a group of folks like Drake, this is pre-Kendrick, and Kevin Garnett and others who were involved in any number of aspects of life, who were calling upon the president to grant clemency as a categorical matter to those individuals who were serving nonviolent marijuana offenses in federal prison. Received some good attention for whatever those letters can actually gin up. We then had an opportunity to meet with the then senior advisor to the president, Cedric Richmond, who was said we provided, along with Jim Cole, a series of what we thought were some decent criteria to think about if the president were to go ahead and grant a categorical clemency, commute the sentence as Laurie said, the most arguably controversial of the potential uses or the potential types of clemency. But the argument seemed very strong to us in an era where half the nation has more than half allows medical marijuana, and more than half of the population of the United States lives in in states that have legalized recreational marijuana, which makes the idea of locking up somebody federally for doing what corporations are doing on an industrial scale kind of silly, and seems to be an obvious place in which clemency would be an appropriate application. Pardons probably all the way around for those who had previously been convicted and were not involved in violence or cartels, and certainly the release of those who were still serving time. We eventually held a symposium. All of the folks on this panel, or many of them, participated in the symposium in the halls of Congress. We had a kind of model. We had for them both the model clemency criteria and had an add-on, which was an expungement statute, which there's been little bits of expungement statutes that have existed over American history, but no single expungement statute that was across the board. And we wanted to vet that as well to see what the responses were. Pretty good feedback. It seemed like things were going well. Weldon ended up testifying before I believe it was the Judiciary Committee, talking about the need for clemency for issues particularly when it got with regards to those who were still locked up in the federal system because of marijuana offenses. Come around October of 2022, shortly after the symposium, shortly after Weldon's testimony, we hear about the president issuing a pardon for marijuana. I think there was a broad cheers across the country. There also was a broad sense of misunderstanding, a belief that, in fact, this had solved all the problems. Of course, it solved none of the problems. It was mostly symbolic. The most important part actually had nothing to do with clemency. It was triggering of the reconsideration of marijuana and its place on the Controlled Substances Act from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Its place on Schedule 1 is laughable, probably was historically and certainly is now. And so that was probably the most important part of a ballyhooed pardon that released no one for an offense which is not predominantly federal, that being simple possession of marijuana. It was later extended to include marijuana use, which I'm not even sure is if they really wanted to apply a previous Supreme Court case, is even constitutional. And I think it was, I can't even remember, it was attempted possession, a simple possession. So 3 general grants, symbolically important, as important as any symbolic grant of clemency in the past, but no practical impact. Nobody was released. The clients that many of us have, or on this panel or others have, contacted us, and we had to tell them bad news that it did jack diddly over squat. But that was okay. The belief was that there were still 2 years left, and that there were promises had been made on the campaign by the Biden administration, by President Biden himself. We can give laurels or throw tomatoes at the president however you wish, and it really is. It depends on politics now, no doubt. He did say some things, and it is one of his histories is maybe misstating things a wee bit. He kept on talking about expungement, which of course he has no power to do. And finally, they corrected him on that at the very end. He talked about releasing people from prison for marijuana, and seemed to be pushing for the notion that, in fact, he'd done that with that pardon, when in fact, the only person who would have actually been released due to that pardon would have been some poor chump who had been arrested for simple possession on the mall or something like that. So this was a kind of a little bit still misleading push that promises had been kept, but nonetheless, we still hoped. We hoped that particularly maybe towards the end of the administration, or maybe as a handoff to if it were to be President Harris, that he would clean the docket of important clemency cases, including our clients. Just before Let's Fast Sunday, there was even a bill that was dropped that built upon a smaller bill, the Marijuana Misdemeanor Expungement Act, that was the model that we had turned up for this congressional symposium. And it has been submitted twice in two separate Congresses, which is, I don't know if Congress really has a three strikes rule or not on these things or not, but at least twice now. But this past week, just before Sunday's big news, the Weldon Angelos Presidential Pardon Expungements Act got dropped. It is it's HR 10248. I think a pretty important bill connecting pardon and expungement after 200 years and 200 years of jurisprudence that has pointed in different directions as to what a pardon does and what it doesn't do. This was all great. And then Hunter Biden was pardoned. And that is almost full stop the end of the story. That put, it was like if there was a record on a turntable, it's that screech noise, and has caused this frenzy that is currently afoot. I will leave it with this. There are, as Rachel and Larry said, there are people who deserve to be released from federal prison. There is a question as to whether they should have been there in the first place. Promises were made. We're out of time. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Doug.
Thank you so much, Eric. And a number of the comments already, and we'll get back to them in the Q&A, is the role for Congress in broader discussions of clemency and other kinds of record relief. And so terrific for discussing that background quickly as well. And so that means we're left with Mark. Mark, you're up, and take it away.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks to the Ohio State University for this incredibly well-timed event. I'm going to circle back and follow up on what Rachel started us out with and add a little bit of historical perspective. When you look back at the history of clemency in the federal system in the United States, there's really different eras. And in the 19th century, we saw it being used. Sometimes it was used categorically, for example, in the wake of the Civil War for people involved with the Confederacy, with members of the Latter-day Saints Church, and others. And then in the 20th century, up and through President Reagan, we saw really vigorous use of clemency by presidents, where it was considered regularly from the day they took office. Even a president like Hoover, who we don't think of as being particularly active in this area, he granted almost 1,200 petitions, at a time when the federal criminal system was much, much smaller, a fraction of what it is today. And then we get to Reagan, and President Reagan actually had a 12% grant rate. It was mostly pardons, but 12%. If President Biden granted 12% of the petitions that have come in to him, that would be almost 1,600 grants compared to the under 200 that he has. And then something changed. We had an era through the Clinton-Bush years and the first term of Barack Obama, where basically it fell into desuetude, that there was not an active use of clemency in the way that we'd seen historically. And that had a lot to do with process, as Rachel and I and others have written about. And then at the end of the Obama term, of course, we saw the Clemency Initiative that really did accomplish something, although it left way too much on the table. And that brings us to the current era. And I'm sure that it would not hearten the Biden people to hear this, but I think we really have to consider the Trump-Biden era as one, because we've seen the same use of clemency from both, which is precious few grants for those who have followed the rules and filed their petition, and much more towards friends and family. And that is not a principled use of clemency, but that's where we're at. I do think that when we turn to solutions, that we do have to look closely at process. One thing that happened is eventually during the Trump years, I got a little fed up and turned my attentions to Minnesota and pushed for reforms here, collaborated with a bunch of people in the state, and we did get the process changed. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole process and how we changed it, but we changed the process in substantive ways, in some ways that tracked the proposals that Professor Barkow and I raised all the way back in 2015. And it's made a very significant difference, that we've gone from about a 30% grant rate to it looks like we're going to be over 90% in the upcoming cycle. And we didn't have commutations for 30 years in this state, and now we do fairly regularly. And that's because we didn't change the players necessarily. There was the Chief Justice changed, but what we changed was the process, and this allowed for consideration of more grants and a higher grant rate to deserving people while they're still being well vetted. The process in the federal system is still the problem. And the fact that we have a hardworking, a good pardon attorney doing the job and making recommendations that are at the White House, hundreds of them, of the people whose stories we know, and we know how deserving they are, and they're being ignored. And that's an abrogation of a duty of the president. I'm going to leave with one particularly damning fact about the process we have. The pardon attorney of the United States is designated as the advisor to the president on clemency. I have a very good off-the-record source that tells me that the current pardon attorney, who's been there for 4 years, has never met President Biden. And if that's where we're at, we need to change things so that the clemency, the pardon clause, the Constitution itself can be used in a principled way by presidents who see it as a force for mercy rather than favoritism.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm going to open it up, although I'm going to do so by leaning into some of the process comments that a number of you made along the way. I especially want to also put in a plug for the federal system drawing some insight and inspiration from state clemency processes. We've been very lucky at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center to be helping Ohio Governor DeWine on an expedited pardon process that has, like Mark is suggesting, been real integral to increasing, getting good cases in front of the governor and a significant increase in grants as a result. And so to talk a little bit about the process, probably a number of folks on the Zoom know, and I know all of you know, that there'd been lots of criticism. In fact, I think many candidates for president in 2020, including now President Biden, campaigned around the clemency process and the need to either get DOJ, the Department of Justice, out of the process or change their role. Yet, if nothing else, it does seem like that's been improved. My perception, and Mark, you spoke to it, and I think Rachel, you did too as well, is that in the past, while it had seemed like DOJ was a break, and Larry mentioned maybe any hints of violence may be part of that story, and combing a record to try to find reasons to not move a petition on, that seems to have improved. Does that mean we think DOJ should be part of an improved process? Is it still structurally and fundamentally, in all of your view, a problem that the pardon attorney, especially if the pardon attorney doesn't meet with the president, but I wouldn't expect some other body of appointed folks who weren't otherwise sort of in the president's inner circle? Isn't there, I guess maybe this is the right way to say it, isn't there a challenge as we try to come up with a better process that it either becomes, friends and family know how to work that new process, or something that gets encumbered, even if it's not encumbered by DOJ's history, by some other set of procedural mechanisms that may not end up, at least in an efficient way, getting cases to the president's desk, as quickly and as regularly as we might all hope in theory, but in practice, it's never quite worked out that way. That was a wide-ranging way to say, can we ever get the process right? Or are there particular aspects of process, maybe this is a more pointed question, that you'd like to see, whether it's President Trump in the future or future presidents, to be focused on as a real way to improve this process?
Doug, we don't have a history of failure in reform. Reform hasn't been tried. The system that we've got was never intentionally constructed. It kind of accreted over time the way bureaucracies do. And there has not yet been a single attempt to chop that down and start over. So we don't have some history of failure with this. This would be the first time we're trying to do it right. The only other thing I'd want to add is that The fact that we have a good pardon attorney doesn't mean that we have to jettison that person and their staff. If you had, for example, a sentencing commission, as Professor Barkow and I have suggested, then the pardon attorney and her staff could simply advise that commission and do much of the same work that they do now.
Doug, let me discuss what goes on in the DOJ process. I've read wonderful articles by Rachel and Mark criticizing the process, and I agree with what they say. It's an overly cumbersome and very ineffective process that goes through too many levels of review. Now, Mark and Rachel have suggested maybe an independent commission outside of the pardon attorney's office. Mark seems to be saying now we might keep the pardon attorney's office. We'll see about that. But I'm a strong believer in the pardon attorney's office. I worked there for 5 years. I think they do very good work. The problem is the way we treat the applications for clemency, because they go to the pardon attorney's office. They are very carefully reviewed and assessed there, and recommendations come out of the pardon attorney's office, signed off by the pardon attorney. To me, at that point, it should go up to the White House. And if it doesn't go to the White House, then it should go to the person called the Associate Attorney General, who is the person in charge of the civil side of DOJ, because the present process is that the pardon attorney's recommendation goes to the Deputy Attorney General. Well, the Deputy Attorney General is the top prosecutor, federal prosecutor in the country, responsible for all the federal prosecutors. And so what you're getting is a recommendation that goes to somebody who represents all these prosecutors who stand by their work and don't want to see anything modified. That's a real mistake. The pardon attorney's recommendation should be more valued and should go either directly to the president or to White House counsel, or to the Deputy or Associate Attorney General, who's not a prosecutor, and then up to the White House. And number one, that cuts down the number of reviews, but more importantly, it cuts out the prosecutorial bias against grants of clemency, especially a grant of commutation. So that's what I would recommend.
Although, can I just add, I'm not as optimistic that just giving it to the Associate Attorney General does the trick, because I think it's being part of the culture at DOJ that's the problem. And so I think, even if it's the civil division, they're all in the same building, they're all in team meetings all the time. I just think you get prosecutor culture creep in that building. And the other thing I would just highlight is, and Larry, if this is still happening, the process has always been you go to the prosecutor's office that brought the case in the first place when a petition is filed, my understanding, and you ask them, hey, what do you think? I don't think anyone in their right mind would design a clemency process where you wanted to get an objective look at this person today, and the first place you'd go to is the office that invested all the resources into prosecuting the case in the first place, and their last memory of the person was when they sought that very same sentence. So, to me, I think the prosecutor influence is even deeper than the DAG's involvement. I think it's a DOJ problem. It's that getting the input of the U.S. Attorney's Office that brought the case. And so I'd wipe all that clean if it were up to me.
If you don't mind, Doug, 2 chairs, 1 quibble. I agree totally. I would take it further. I don't think the pardon attorney should be in the Justice Department at all. I don't think it should be answerable to anybody in the Justice Department. It's an independent power under the Constitution, and I'm not so sure that necessarily needs to be under the kind of criminal enforcement heading that the Attorney General has assumed. So, but I think I'm in total agreement with what everybody said. That's not a critique. That's just I take it the next step. The quibble is not that, and I'm not sure that it's more of this is the way it may be, and it's with regards to the president's pardon power. And everybody's favorite recent Supreme Court case, Trump versus U.S., or at least the academ's favorite, described, among others, the president's pardon power as one of his core constitutional powers. They described it as, quote unquote, unrivaled gravity and breadth. It said, here's the quote: the president's authority to pardon, in other words, is conclusive and preclusive. I'd argue it's also non-delegable, right? That's why Liz Oyer's job, which she does to echo what people said splendidly. She's probably the best pardon attorney in a long time. And she has done a great job, but she can only do so much. The buck stops. Harry Truman was right when it comes to the pardon power. It stops with Joe Biden, and he has not done what he's supposed to do. So what I just said is more of a way of saying some of the ideas which are extraordinary, which I support in a kind of a constitutional evaluation. They sound great. I agree. Administrative law or having process or committees involved. This all sounds like it might share the blame that will come with any given Willie Horton moment, right? That's great. But I can see the Supreme Court striking anything down that constrains the president. And even if it kind of does it in a kind of negative Commerce Clause way, that's inside baseball, but if it does it even in that way, I think that the Supreme Court might say you can't do it.
No,
So
I love the inside baseball in part because my last process question, I won't hold myself to that maybe, but is, is this something that only the president can do to fix the process, or do we think there's a role for Congress to sort of aid along the way? And I can imagine, depending on what a statute looks like, I know there was a proposal in the last Congress, the Fixed Clemency Act, that tried its best to kind of dance around possible constitutional objections, but I guess I just like, not quite a lightning round, but imagine me as the incoming new representative who just thinks the process needs to be better. I don't want to intrude. I don't want to step on the president's toes, but I just want to make the process as good as it can be. Is there anything, even aside from the politics, just as a matter of policy, that we think Congress could do without it itself getting bogged down in litigation and uncertainty and challenges around trying to make this process anything other than the royal prerogative that it seems to function as?
I mean, I'll just quickly say, so Congress could just create substitute mechanisms that do everything that the clemency power does. So what I would advocate for, if you don't want to worry about crossing the constitutional line, pass that expungement legislation that Eric was talking about. Create other mechanisms for sentences to get reduced. So they could kind of create complementary processes through legislation that would not pose constitutional problems. To me, that would be step one. And then step two could possibly be providing funding for any advisory board that the president wanted to establish. And, Eric's right, it could never be a board that in any way restricted the president's power, but the president absolutely has the ability to create advisory boards like that. And, that is what we saw with the Vietnam set of pardons, is there was a board. So we have historical precedent, it was fine. And the idea would be to create something like that, but for clemency more generally.
just a quick add-on to echo everything I totally agree with. There is already a shadow process that exists out there. It's called compassionate release. If you look at the right cases under the First Step Act, it's essentially a judicial variation of clemency. If you would look at the jurisprudence, and so there are already things that exist out there. That's an Article 3 mechanism created by Congress to as a relief valve. I would highly advise expanding that or its availability. It used to be compassionate release, used to be something held by the BOP as though it was uranium in a high security facility. So I would support expanding that, as well as the expungement bill that we mentioned.
I think our experience with compassionate release, though, really emphasizes why we need clemency too. I'm all for the changes in compassionate release and its expanded use, but we have to recognize the incredible disparities that have arisen, where Western District of North Carolina grants less than 5% and Oregon's over 65%. It's geographically random. Then that's just not fair. That's not a national program. And the beauty of clemency is there is the ability nationally to have a common principled use of the power. And so something like compassionate release, while it's good and it's got to be part of the solution, it can never, or something like that, can never be seen as a replacement for clemency, just because it's going to create a patchwork of disparities, not just regionally, which we measure now, but because we don't get the stats from the Sentencing Commission, within a single district, you're going to have incredible disparities too. And that's just not fair, and it's not right. And that's why, we've needed clemency since the beginning. As Hamilton wrote in Federalist 74, that's in the conscience of one person, that we can have that kind of common consideration of mercy that's necessary.
Mark, I think you're right that compassionate release won't solve many problems because really it's very difficult to get somebody released under that statute federally. It's better in DC, which I've been doing compassionate release motions and second chance motions in DC for 3 years. I believe, as Rachel said, we need another federal statute that is something of a second chance, maybe call it the second step statute, that says that anybody in federal custody can come before the court after a certain number of years in order to argue for release. That's just something, for example, in Washington, DC, we have a statute called IRA that allows anybody who committed the crime under the age of 25 to go before the court with a motion after 15 years in custody and get out. And I practiced under that statute, and the people under that statute are people convicted of murder. We're talking about serious crimes, and people are getting out of custody under IRA. Every state should have that, and the federal government should have that, because compassionate release is not working very well. As you say, it's you need judges who think a certain way to release people under compassionate release now. Even though it was expanded under Trump's administration, it still is no solution. And you've got to expand clemency too. And what I'd say about the idea of Congress getting involved, it should be remembered that the president just has this unbridled power, and fine, if the president wants to cooperate with what Congress does, that's good and well, but the president can do anything he or she wants when it comes to clemency. And let me just say, I was in the office under Trump for over a year, heading that office, that Trump basically took the whole advisory process offline and made his decisions from the White House, and just ignored DOJ because he had an underlying animosity to DOJ. So Congress can do things that are advisory, but we've got to get the president to change the process because it is the process belonging to the authority of the president.
Larry, I would say, I think it would, I don't like the idea of a legislative second chance the way you're suggesting it, that goes back to judges for the same reason, that even if it's not compassionate release and there's different rules, judges are just going to vary based on their ideas about criminal justice, and you're going to have a patchwork. Clemency is unique in that way. And I think that there's been, a wealth of suggestions thrown out there about send it back to judges, and they all have the same problem. That if we create something like that as a substitute for clemency, we're allowing the president to abrogate that important responsibility and step away from it. And I don't think we should issue that invitation.
Quick addendum, which is just this. I have to check the transcript, and I might have to make an addendum to my own. I was just suggesting that expanding compassionate release not as like the alternative, right? The president, of course, has got to continue. And you think about what the pardon power does. It will always have the great power of rapidity. If the president wants to get somebody out like his son, he did it like that. No court can do that, right? It has to, even if there is a wrongfully convicted person, there are going to be hearings that go on forever. So there are values to that. I'm not claiming, nobody's claiming that they are substitutes. But when people are being kind of tight-fisted about the use of it, you got to find other mechanisms. That's all I would suggest.
And I think it's a great conversation that I want to move us on from, about kind of what becomes substitute, what becomes supplement, either formally or informally. And those are things that are, I think, ever evolving. Here I want to turn to the last Biden-centric topic, at least unless others want to bring stuff up, and that's to this idea of blanket clemency or categorical clemency to certain groups. And we've seen in the press a number of folks pressing, and I'm not even sure this is a comprehensive list. We've heard recommendations to clear all of federal death row with commutations. We've heard suggestions of a preemptive pardon. Thanks again, Larry, for reviewing what that means to all individuals in the government who might be subject to future political prosecution. Eric's been working on the federal marijuana offenders, which again has been President Biden's one categorical clemency to date, though only to the possession offenders. There's these old law prisoners who come up in the context of this compassionate release discussion who are kind of falling between existing legal regimes that folks have recommended clemency for. I think, Rachel, you've mentioned the CARES Act releasees who are at risk of going back into prison potentially. I guess descriptive and normative, like, do you think there'll be categorical clemencies coming, or is just the case-by-case reality more likely to be what President Biden's going to do in his final weeks in office? And kind of this gets to Mark's point about, disparity or unevenness. I guess a categorical clemency can be a version of equal justice, but not necessarily if we think there's a bunch of different kinds of cases in that mix. And I think that maybe explains President Biden's decision to just do marijuana possession offenders, a concern that if he did trafficking offenses in a categorical way, even just for marijuana, that would pick up some folks who might have also been involved in more serious law breaking. And so I'm just sort of eager for your take on categorical clemency as a concept, and then whether we think we're going to get any grants like that, or if it's just going to be case by case, though maybe a lot of case by case in the weeks ahead. Jump in as you see fit.
I'll jump in. I always do. But in terms of categorical, I would love to see death row cleared. I would love to see a grant to all the people who have a positive recommendation. I mean, Rachel and I wrote about this in September in the Times. I don't see that coming from President Biden, except maybe the death row, because there's such a strong principle behind that. Presidents have varying levels of boldness and timidity. And what we've seen out of Biden is a high level of timidity, which means that it seems like, we argued for years to reduce the bureaucracy. He increased it by involving the Domestic Policy Council directly in consideration of petitions. I just don't see them having the will to do a categorical grant, with the possible exception of death row. And I'd be surprised and thrilled if that happens.
Let me add to that, Mark, that one thing that hasn't been done, I tried to get funds to do it while I was in the pardon attorney's office, is follow up on what happens to people whose sentences are commuted, because we need to know about the recidivism rate. What we know informally is that the recidivism rate of the 1,700 plus inmates that were released under Obama was that their recidivism was down under like 5%. I mean, just amazing, given that for federal inmates, recidivism after release is probably up in the 40–50% range. So your suggestion that Biden should just grant all the positive recommendations from the pardon attorney's office. What was shown under the Clemency Initiative is when the pardon attorney's office makes a recommendation, it's a sound recommendation that rarely results in any problem for the community. And this should push. Biden was vice president when the Clemency Initiative was going on, and he really hasn't stepped forward.
I still have a candle in my window. I'm looking at the countdown: 40 days, 23 hours, 11 minutes, and 13 seconds. He's got, and this will be a disappointment. And academics are disappointed constantly because we don't get to be judges and we pretend like we are. But there are real people who are affected by this. This will be a real disappointment, and I don't know what the Democratic Party will do. If the Trump administration were smart, they'd steal clemency from the Democrats. And so 40 days, 23 hours, 10 minutes, and 42 seconds now.
And
So
that's also the countdown for Ross Albright expecting a clemency from Trump. So we'll get to the Republicans in a minute. But Rachel, why don't you finish us up on this categorical clemency issue?
I just want to point out that, not all categorical grants are equal. And so, the one thing I'm on the lookout for is I just want to make sure that he engages in real clemency review. Because what I don't love is that marijuana initiative, when it was announced, to great fanfare, this is the most amazing thing, 7,000, people eligible. And, it got all kinds of press and young people love it. And it was all smoke and mirrors, because you go on the pardon attorney's website and it's like 100 some people have applied and gotten it. They were already all out from prison anyway. And so I'm a little worried. I'm a little worried that they're going to try another smoke and mirrors thing. Like, oh my gosh, we've given clemency to 1,000 people, and it turns out they're all CARES Act people who are already out, that frankly should have been done at the beginning of the administration as like a housekeeping matter. So, in terms of what I'm looking for, it would be something of real substance. Certainly what Mark says, if you commuted everybody on federal death row, that is brave. That is morally courageous. That is legacy material. I mean, that is something that would deserve real applause from President Biden, because that takes moral courage. And I actually think it would go down historically as a truly great presidential event. I think it's rare that presidents have the opportunity to do something like that. I think that would be one. That would be in that category. And I'll just say, granting all the positive recommendations from the pardon attorney's office would also be bold, and it would actually achieve what President Biden wanted to, which is respect for DOJ. I think if you grant them all and you make an announcement that says, I respect my Department of Justice, I know what they went through to evaluate these petitions, I know how hard it is to run that gauntlet, and I respect the people who work there, and getting a yes from them is so hard. So if you get that yes, I respect what they do, and I'm going to show you today by showing you, you have the announcement, you have the big stack of paper next to you, I've granted them all. And that's legacy material too. What isn't is the like big symbolic thing that is actually not meaningful. And I don't want to say that, a CARES Act grant is meaningful for the people who are out on home confinement. They deserve it. They should get it. But that's not what I think any of us are talking about on this panel. When we're assessing the clemency record overall, that's like bare minimum should have been done 3 years ago. What we're looking for in this last stretch here is the real stuff. You grant the pardon attorney recommendations, you do something like you commute the entirety of death row. That's significant.
And Doug, one last quick point on this too, and that is that presidents have no problem with categorical rejection. Every president has done that. President Obama did, even during the initiative, very clearly. And in a system that really should be canted towards mercy, that if we have categorical rejections, there should be an openness to categorical grants as well.
That's a very good point. And actually, I want to bring up one of the comments I saw that highlights that I think sometimes the biggest challenge with a categorical approach is which of the many categories that are, not quite competing for attention, but somebody mentioned in the comments, all the women who were raped at FCI Dublin and the number of folks who have really been, subject to just extraordinarily harsh and truly criminal conditions through their time in BOP. Again, that's a group that would seem deserving in all sorts of ways, and yet both to identify them and then use them as a class to make a statement kind of in the way you were suggesting, Rachel, about just, what's to be respected and what's not to be respected in DOJ's work is I think another thing to keep in mind. All right. Speaking of keeping things in mind, I'm going to keep in mind all the promises that incoming President-elect Trump made. And there's lots of ways we could frame this. I'll start with just sort of maybe prediction. I believe he promised on his first day to commute the sentence of Ross Albright. For those who don't know that name, that's the fellow behind the Silk Road website, dark web website, and who was convicted of a series of drug transactions and linked to a number of violent crimes and is serving, I believe, a life sentence. There's been that promise for the first day. The NBC News interview this past weekend, we heard President-elect Trump saying that he was planning to, on his very first day, get quickly moving on the January 6th pardons that he's been talking about on the trail for quite some time. Just kind of will there be clemencies on the first day of the new president's term? And then I guess the follow-up is, and wouldn't that be a really good thing, even if we may not agree with how the power is being used? Could we celebrate the possibility of a new tradition, not of January 20th pardons by the person leaving, but January 20th pardons by the person entering? Thoughts?
It's a great lead up, Doug.
I mean, look, I think clemency is an important authority, and it is something, you want to celebrate the power, but I think you do need to evaluate who it's given to. So for me, it does depend on how it's exercised on that day. I like the idea of starting from day one with an agenda, and, and people voted, I actually admire the fact that he was transparent in saying what he was going to do with the power. I actually think, that would not be my priority, his priorities, but hey, he came clean. He's like, you know what? I have this power. I'm going to use it. And people knew it and they voted for him. And so, that's also something that he in Mark's timidity, bravery spectrum, that is not timid. That is just coming clean and saying, I'm going to do this. And I do think people responded to that. I think people actually like that. Like, it doesn't look like that, oh, it's like this symbolic thing that's not real. It's like, no, I'm going to do X. So, I think there's something to be said for that transparency and that openness and that willingness to take a chance. But having said all that, if it on day one, it's somebody who was part of a violent insurrection against the country, no, that I won't applaud.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been saying for years that I want people running for president to say how they would use clemency, and someone finally did, and that was Trump. One thing too about it is that when we see how presidents use clemency, it reflects their principles. Lincoln was a storyteller. People came in with a great story. He responded to that. President Obama went to a prison, sat down with people who had committed narcotics crimes, and said, literally, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And then crafted a system that favored, people who had narcotics offenses. And with Trump, we knew that what he values is loyalty. That's never been a secret. And the fact that he's using or proposes using clemency to reflect those values, and that, that part of his personality shouldn't be surprising.
But we should be very clear on how Trump operates with the pardon power. I don't think this panel is in favor of the clemency towards January 6th offenders, but the pattern Trump clearly engaged in during his first administration, which I predict will be the same pattern for his second, is what people call his transactional way of approaching everything, which is everything he does in exercising his power comes with the question, what's in it for me? What am I going to get from it? It's all self-serving. And of course, it's either some crony that he wants to do something for to get something in response, or it's some people who he thinks will, if he grants them a benefit such as clemency, it will increase his supporters and his electoral chances. So clearly, the way Trump is going to operate is just an abomination of using the pardon power. That said, not only would it be objectionable for him to pardon the January 6th offenders, but I sure hope that he's not planning, as he just did it recently, of putting each of them in an ambassador position, as Jared Kushner's father got after being pardoned.
Here's my prediction, solely predictive. So it's like the odds boards that are now everywhere in all sports. Russell Brick will get pardoned, or at least clemency, and will be released. There will be pardons in J6. I think there hopefully is a clever way to do it. It may be an argument that would require categorical clemency, so it avoids including some folks who may not who even from the president's perspective and the perspective of the incoming administration would not want to have their imprimatur on that person being released. I think there'll be at least one law professor who probably gets pardoned, John Eastman, and I hope that there are a series of folks who are, again, this is the one that I'm actually putting the pitch for, which is, given that we're likely to see either the rescheduling of marijuana Schedule 3 or Trump just simply pushing it through Congress and taking it off the schedules altogether. Anybody who remains in federal prison for marijuana, nonviolent marijuana, and with all the conditions that Doug said, like, were you a member of a hit gang? No, with the limitations, I bet he does those groups as well. Each of them will have some constituency. Shocker, it's a political power. So we'll see, but that's just predictive, except for that last group who I think absolutely should be out yesterday.
And I'll throw in, just for conversation about possibilities, I could imagine a categorical clemency for all Jan 6 defendants convicted of misdemeanors, and then kicking the felony defendants to some other kind of process, maybe. And I guess this is where I'll kind of shape it for thinking for the future. Let's imagine a world in which, Biden grants some grants but doesn't do anything particularly bold or big, and then Trump comes in, does a blanket pardon for Jan 6 misdemeanors, creates an advisory group to advise him on felony Jan 6 cases, and maybe also marijuana cases, Eric, in the wake of rescheduling. And we end up with literally hundreds of both pardons and clemencies in his first year. Good for the pardon power, good for the clemency power. Is it ultimately, we we know how statistics go, and sad as a Yankee fan that I am, that Juan Soto set a record for salary for a professional ball player. A whole bunch of other professional ball players are thinking, I want to get that number even higher. And in the same way, would there be, even if folks here don't like who might get the beneficiary of it, if Trump sets a record in his first year of clemency grants, that becomes a useful benchmark for future use of the power? Or is it always going to be, Trump gets to do what Trump gets to do and everybody else has to play by different rules?
I think who it's bad for, if that happens, is the people in the pipeline right now. The people who we've had this process where you're supposed to file a petition, get people to support you, get support letters, take programming, be able to assert that you've changed your life. And thousands of people did just that, and they've been ignored and ignored and ignored. Because I have a clinic where we do that work, I know their stories, and it's terrible that we've got all these other considerations that are in play, and what's shoved to the side over and over again are the people who did what we told them to do after they were convicted, that they rehabilitated themselves. They did the hard work. They mended relationships, and they're just ignored. Until we get that process right, that's going to continue to happen.
And I should say that I would be astonished if Trump actually used a nonpartisan independent advisory group in connection with clemency. That is not his approach over 4 years during his first term, and I don't expect it'll be now. But that would actually be a step forward if he did that, even if it wasn't the pardon attorney's office.
One, and maybe not a pitch, but an argument for the perhaps bacchanalia of clemency that we'll see. I don't know how else to exorcise the ghosts of Willie Horton and things like that. I think that may be such a purge of that, and such a change of the way you even look at it, that it may be an opening. So there's one positive, optimistic. I'll give you this as an analogy. The Posse Comitatus Act, awful law when it was enacted. It tried to essentially get the federal government out of the southern states, just so that they could reinforce segregation, or what would be the de facto equivalent of slavery. Today, is Posse Comitatus an important concept? Yeah. We shouldn't be using this standing army in domestic enforcement. That's a great principle. It started from something awful, but it is nonetheless a principle that I would say is pretty good, and one you'd want to stick with. So if this opens up clemency, and even if you don't like how the people that are in the group, if it unplugs this hole and allows it out the drain, and allows actually some of them to flow through, we should probably just accept that and move on and think about how to continue it in a positive way. At least that's my suggestion.
So, Doug, let me be the downer here, since that's usually my role, to just say, I just think what Trump does is in a category of its own, because he had a batch of grants in his last administration, and they've committed horrible crimes. He's got people that he granted to who have these really terrible domestic violence convictions, that if it was any other person running, we would see political ads where he would be Willie Hortoned by those grants that he made. But I think when you're talking about President Trump, you are in a whole different category of things. And I personally don't think another would-be president thinks, yes, I can do what he does. I think that is a whole different kind of blueprint for a presidential persona that only he has shown us he can inhabit. So if he does do that, I actually don't think it's going to be precedent setting. I think it will be like so many things Trump specific.
I am trying to have a sunny conclusion, and that was, I think, an appropriately kind of downer counterpoint, because I think it is right that both, what Trump does and what that means is unique in every sense, and trying to predict that is also incredibly challenging. But with a few minutes left, I want to just sort of open it up for any sort of closing thoughts. Again, any things that I didn't get to, or sort of predictions for the future. Especially, I fear that there will be any number of folks who are extraordinarily hopeful that Biden will use his clemency pen a lot in the next few weeks, that may be hoping that Trump then has an openness to this beyond the groups that he's specifically spoken of on the trail, and just sort of thoughts about maybe even what advocates for clemency could do looking forward. Again, not just to the coming Trump term, but again, thinking about where that could take us for the clemency power over time. I know there have been, and I didn't bring it up directly, but some folks so frustrated by the Hunter Biden pardon, there's been some public commentary about eliminating the pardon power altogether. I don't think a constitutional amendment is especially likely, or that's going to go anywhere, but kind of welcome to any big thoughts as we wrap it up. And I share my thanks again for your time and sharing your instincts and insights about all these issues.
I'm the designated optimist to Rachel's pessimism usually. Then I do want to say a couple things. And one is that I do think that for advocates, we can't let up, that, there may be chaos that is perceived within Trump forming up his government, but there's always opportunity within chaos. That regardless of what happened with clemency, the First Step Act was real. And it was something he signed that made a huge difference. It had a bigger impact on people getting out of prison than the Obama clemency initiative. The other thing, too, is that I think that we need to take seriously the damage to President Biden's legacy that has occurred. That one of the things that I think, as we have to recognize as a all-white panel, is that people of color, they have suffered under the criminal justice system for centuries now. And think about what Biden did. So he looked at a system shot through with racial disparities that are outrageous, with a legacy of racism embedded within it, granted clemency to one affluent white guy, then jetted off to Africa to give speeches about the legacy of slavery. How do you think that lands to people of color in prison? And it should land that way to all of us. That is unconscionable, to have a trip around the world about the legacy of slavery when you've got this tool to address the legacy of slavery that you so consciously don't use before you go, while highlighting it by giving that grant to your own son. Rant concluded.
And I'll just add to that. I want to pile on by saying that I think, when President Biden ran for president, when he was speaking to Black communities, he had to deal with the baggage of being the leading drug warrior of the 1980s and spearheading the legislation that frankly has a lot of those people in prison. They're there serving mandatory minimums that were passed under President Biden's watch when he was in the Senate. And he was like one of the leading figures pushing for all that. And when he ran for president, he knew that was baggage. And he talked about how he was a changed person and he saw things differently. And he gave a kind of pseudo apology for it. it. But, you know, actions speak louder than words. And there have been no actions. You know, I understand he couldn't get things through Congress. This wasn't a cooperative congressional body to get a lot done. I wish he had done more to use the bully pulpit to at least make the effort like he had been trying. But, you know, I get it. He might have thought that was futile. But the clemency power is how a president can express their values and communicate what they stand for and what they believe in. And I think he needs to think about that, or at least his advisors who are talking to him at this point need to really say, like, this is where you leave an imprint that's very personal. And he knows it's personal because, you know, he knew he could say something about what he was doing with Hunter, but he needs to think about other people's children, and he needs to think about his own legacy in putting them in for these very long sentences. And I hope it's not too late. I hope somehow this message is getting through, because I think there is still time for him to do serious damage control to his legacy. But if it stops today, then I think this will go down as actually one of the worst clemency records we've ever seen.
And let me just add, I think Biden's clemency record is miserable, but Trump's record over his 4 years and now in the coming 4 years is going to be even worse, because it's going to be so abusive of any fairness and integrity standards. But I think Mark is right to talk about opportunity. When Trump for 4 years takes the entire regular protocol of the clemency process offline, it at least allows an opportunity for a new president coming in after Trump to reconstruct the clemency process in the ways that we're talking about now, making radical changes so it'll be fair, it'll be effective, and it'll be exercised with some vigor by the next president.
With respect to Larry, who has a tremendous amount of experience and did great work in the OPA, I take just a slightly different perspective on this, and that would be, I don't think I'm not saying he's saying this, but I don't think the pardon power should lie dormant for 4 years. And I think there is a president. We can bicker about it all we want, but he's going to be the president. That's one of his powers. And I don't think we should, the hope that we just hope he doesn't even touch it. That's not only a non-starter, it is probably not a good thing for the constitutional democracy as a whole, even recognizing all the complaints and the concerns that have been raised. This would be the hope. And again, a lot of people had hope in his first term. The second time around, maybe not. I recognize that's certainly in academia with some that might have conservative leanings or libertarian leanings. They may have lost that hope in the first term. But let me put it the old saying probably still applies. I thought it was going to be Biden, but I was wrong. I thought, for the reasons that were said, he was a drug warrior, that maybe he could be the Nixon that goes to China. He wasn't. At least he didn't do it what he was supposed to. Maybe Trump can. And I know that many in academia and elsewhere in America are essentially going to live in internal exile. But those who engage and put pressure, there's still Congress. There are still people who will be working for the president, who will be interested in these topics. I would suggest not disengaging, and even maybe not with boundless hope. See the possibilities that maybe there could be a change, a turn of the page that is not negative, but in fact may even be positive.
So thank you all, and let me thank those who stayed on the Zoom, and in particular, extra thank you to all of our speakers. I want to get a last minute in to plug where I kind of see possibilities that whomever is president, I think we just need new traditions, right? So we have the turkey pardon, which we've all gotten tired of complaining about, that it goes turkeys only and nobody else. And the number of articles talking about turkeys 2, human 0 for clemency is disconcerting. But I think we not only need to not leave the turkeys behind, but allow other people to get pardoned on that day. But we've got a bunch of other holidays. In particular, I wrote a little Substack where I did some research. The number of countries that grant mass or massive numbers of pardons and clemencies on their Independence Day is really startling. And the fact that we, arguably the first country to have at least as we think about it, Independence Day, don't have a tradition in that vein, that there isn't this expectation or effort by advocates especially to want to have that day honored with people getting independence, whether it's from a criminal conviction or from being imprisoned at the time, I think is one of a number of missed opportunities that I don't have an awful lot of confidence that Trump will start us with these new traditions, but I think it's exactly right. And I'm so grateful to have had all of you to suggest different ways that we can hope to turn the next clemency record to be more heartening at this time 4 years than the one we're talking about right now. Still hopeful. There's, what was it, 40 days left? I won't get the hours and minutes from you, Eric, but incredibly grateful for all of you taking your time and when I know it's especially busy. And thank you. And please, let's keep the conversations going. And those of you in attendance know that this will be posted on the Drug Enforcement and Policy's website in a few days once we get the transcript cleaned up. And we thank you for your engagement. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks again so much for all participants. Really grateful. So valuable to have this discussion right now with all of you. Take care.